Chapter 12. Break Time. Circa 1967. The sleeping bag Heather let Thomas borrow for the night was surprisingly comfortable, despite not being long enough. He was sprawled on top of it now, lying on his back, trying to make sense of nonsense. The conversation with Heather had been incredibly difficult for Thomas. He'd let her talk, and chosen the questions he asked and the answers he gave very carefully so as not to contradict her or raise any alarms. He didn't want her getting nosy about him. Navigating the discussion in this manner had proven difficult for a number of reasons. Bert was dead, first of all. Or should have been. Thomas had almost let that information slip the moment Heather began talking about the professor. Initially, he refrained from doing so only out of courtesy and confusion. But as she continued to talk, he realized he wasn't assessing the situation properly. Words like dead and alive no longer had the same meaning they did 48 hours ago. It was far more complicated now. At the point Thomas had entered the tunnel, Bert was, based on all the evidence, dead. Thomas hadn't seen a body, of course, so he had to allow for the possibility that he'd been lied to even about that. But a far less conspiratorial explanation was right in front of him. If Bert had traveled through the tunnel at any point prior to the date of his death, it was completely reasonable to believe any story Heather told about him. Hell, Bert could have spent days, weeks, months, or years in the past doing who knows what before returning to the timeline Thomas knew him from and then proceeding to die. It used to be a person was either dead or alive in the only moment which could be experienced, the present. Now, a person was always both dead and alive. It was just a matter of which moment one was in. Thomas decided he needed to assume Bert was very much alive in whatever time and place he was currently experiencing. And that's what he needed to figure out next. While he didn't have an exact date, Thomas was, for the moment, operating under the assumption that the tunnel had transported him to Southwest Ohio, sometime during or shortly after 1967, in the late afternoon. He was guessing based on the foliage and temperatures that he'd arrived in late spring or early summer, though it was hard to say as the weather in the Midwest varies greatly March through May. Each of the details had massive implications. The most inexplicable was the physical displacement which had occurred, a phenomenon Thomas hadn't even considered before entering the tunnel, which now seemed utterly necessary and obvious. After all, the revolving Earth wasn't in the same location relative to the Sun on the date he was currently experiencing as it had been on the day he'd left Petersburg in 2010. This meant a movement had been required and occurred across both time and space. How it worked and why he had ended up a few hundred miles southeast of his place of departure he couldn't say. If the tunnel had brought him to the 1960s, but he'd still been in Petersburg, that would have at least made some sense. But this. And then, there was the tunnel. His scientific brain was trying to come up with an answer. Any answer. To his questions related to the tunnel. He had precisely nothing. Even his best solutions relied on what ultimately amounted to magic to work. Scientists hate it when magic is the only solution. After a lengthy but guarded discussion with Heather in the tent, she had assured Thomas that she wouldn't pry into his business. This was convenient, because he had no answers for her, even if she had. She also informed Thomas that she needed to head into town to pick some things up before nightfall. She gave him the option to come with her or stay at the tent, a choice which was very easy for him. As the gravity of the situation became more real, Thomas hated that he had so little concrete information on which to base his decisions. He had no idea what his next move should be. But what he did know is that he wanted to do everything in his power to avoid interacting with anybody he didn't have to. Horror stories from the time travel tales he'd heard as a kid racked his brain. Accidentally step on an ant, change the outcome of the Cold War. Move a rock, the bald eagle is now extinct. The fact that nothing disastrous had already occurred suggested these stories may have been inaccurate, but he wanted to be careful regardless. So Thomas had informed Heather that he would stay behind and welcomed the opportunity to be alone at the campsite. It would not only give him a chance to consider everything he'd learned, but also to snoop around uninterrupted while she was gone. As it turned out, Heather had severely undersold herself when she said she merely enjoyed hiking. In reality, She was currently on a full cross-country road trip, hiking some of the most spectacular venues America had to offer. She'd started in Arizona, moved eastward through New Mexico, Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, before heading northeast toward her final destination, Maine. It was purely coincidence that she happened to be in Ohio when Bert Crane was looking for someone to fill a job for him. Thomas learned that Heather had a car parked less than a half-mile from the location of her tent, hidden off the side of the road in a small flora-covered ravine. It was clear she didn't have the legal right to be camping here, but she didn't seem worried about it. More importantly for Thomas, due to the length and extent of her trip, she already had a second backup tent at the campsite, and apparently a third in the car if needed. They had set up the second tent for Thomas before she left so they could have separate lodgings, as Thomas assumed was only proper in the 1960s. Thomas now found himself looking upward at the shadowed droplets of water streaming down the transparent mesh of the tent, as the last gasp of the rainstorm subsided and darkness settled in. Heather had been gone for about a half an hour, long enough in Thomas' opinion to ensure she wouldn't return unexpectedly soon. While she was gone, he needed to figure some things out. Apart from the how, why, and where of the tunnel, Thomas' primary concern had not changed. Bert Crane. It was undeniable now that Bert was orchestrating events for some purpose. But why he had chosen not to tell Thomas that the tunnel was going to move his physical location made no sense whatsoever. It would have been an easy thing to say and rather helpful information. Was he worried Thomas would have been less willing to go through the tunnel if he had known? Beyond that, why hadn't Bert informed him that he was personally going to come through the tunnel before Thomas in order to set up the Heather-led welcoming committee? And why not just welcome Thomas himself? Heather was the other wild card. He needed to determine if she was telling him the truth or if she had some reason not to. What exactly had Bert told her? From what Thomas had gathered, Heather was completely unaware of the tunnel. She could be withholding information, of course, but if that were the case, she was likely lying about almost everything to him, which was still a possibility. He needed to be cautious. But the question that bothered him the most, the only one that he could have solved long before he even entered the tunnel, still remained unanswered. What on earth was he doing here? He had seemingly accomplished one of the most impossible tasks in the history of the universe, but it was obvious at this point that he wasn't the first to do so. Bert was already here, and clearly more significant than anyone else to all of this, but Thomas had no idea if he could be trusted. So why was Thomas here? What was his goal or purpose? Should he even stay, considering all the potential dangers of doing so? It seemed only Bert Crane could answer these questions, and that was not reassuring. Heather had informed Thomas that they would camp for the night, and then in the morning she would take him to the location Bert had provided her. She claimed she knew nothing more about what would happen at that point. All she knew was the location, and that she was supposed to take Thomas to it at 6 a.m. exactly, the day after he arrived. Why so early? She didn't know that either. The location itself was an overlook at the end of a popular hiking trail at another one of the local state parks. They would go in the morning, and upon his safe delivery, Heather's job would be complete. Thomas waited exactly 40 minutes before he began to investigate Heather's tent. He knew this because he had his cell phone stored deep in one of the secret pockets of his bag. An almost useless device in the 1960s, it was essentially a glorified alarm clock. None of the satellites or cell phone towers it required to do anything worthwhile yet in place. At minimum, he figured it could serve as a camera, assuming he could keep it hidden from others and find somewhere to secretly charge it every now and again. As he unzipped Heather's tent, Thomas set some ground rules, mostly to make him feel less creepy about what he was about to do. Heather seemed like a nice person, and Thomas had no ill will toward her, but based on the weirdness of the situation and the potential of accidentally starting World War III or whatever, Thomas granted himself the leeway to invade her privacy in ways he otherwise never would have considered. The rules were simple. Her clothes and bags were off limits. Everything else visible was free game. She kept the tent very orderly. He needed to make sure it stayed that way to ensure she didn't notice he'd been in it. Unfortunately for Thomas, part of the reason she could keep things so neat is because she didn't have much. To say she was traveling light would have been an understatement. The tent looked far more like the tent of someone spending a night or two in the woods than somebody on a cross-country road trip. She must have kept most of her stuff in her car. Nevertheless, Thomas did manage to find a few things of interest. Almost everything Thomas found provided some intrigue because no matter how menial the objects were, he was still encountering artifacts from an era long gone. Seeing a Snickers bar or a can of Coke from the 1960s was more surreal than Thomas would have guessed. Every item he sifted through reminded him that he was not supposed to be here. It was an eerie feeling he could not explain. After about 10 minutes, finished with his search, Thomas laid out his 3 most important finds. Another map, a newspaper, and oddly enough, a phone book. The newspaper was local. Assuming it was recent, the most important piece of information it provided him with was a firm date. Friday, May 25th, 1967. He had no way of telling how old the paper was, but he was getting closer. Most of the stories he skimmed through were about Southeast Ohio. The biggest national stories were about a nuclear treaty between the United States and Soviet Union and the ratification of the new 25th Amendment the previous week. Apparently it defined presidential succession. Thomas spent more time reading the newspaper than he should have. Heather could be coming back at any time, and she would be on foot, so there was no guarantee he'd hear her coming. But something about knowing these newspaper events had already occurred in the time he'd come from, and that he was now living contemporary to them, made them far more fascinating to him. The map proved to be a crucial find as well. Unlike the road atlas, this was a local tourist map, which focused specifically on the best sights to see in Hocking Hills. It showed the popular hiking trails, landmarks, and restaurants nearby, including the park Thomas and Heather were heading to in the morning, Conkle's Hollow. Better yet, Heather had marked an X on the spot of her campsite's location, which gave Thomas an important point of reference. As far as the fate of Thomas Redmond was concerned, however, the phone book proved to play the most vital role. One could make a strong argument that it did more to alter the fate of his journey through time than anything else. Initially, Thomas flipped through the pages like one reading an old history book, giving special attention to anything that stoked his curiosity. But eventually, he did what anyone would do. He started to look for names that he might know, and addresses. And that changed everything. As he leafed through the very new pages containing what to him was very old information, his thoughts on the entire situation began to change. He realized he'd been given a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. What should he do with it? Bert had briefly mentioned saving his father, but Thomas couldn't really buy into that. Surely altering his currently teen father's life in even a minor way would have massive consequences on Thomas's own existence, potentially even preventing it. It could also have impossible to predict ramifications on the timeline as a whole. So what should he do? And that's when he saw it. An ad in the business section for a department store in Dublin, Ohio. It was at that precise moment that, despite never being a part of it, Thomas began to yearn for the past he was now encountering as the present. Big Ed's department store was the Redmonds family business, currently owned and operated by Edward Redmond Sr., Thomas's grandfather on his father's side. A cheesy black and white photo of the young man who would one day become the old man he would call Grandpa Ed stared back at him. It occurred to Thomas in that moment that Dublin wasn't very far from where he was, and that's when the justification started racing through his head. An intelligent man trying to justify an action is always dangerous. His primary justification, and likely the one which ultimately permitted Thomas to make the decisions he did, was Bert Crane's dual existence in the 1960s. It was clear to Thomas that Bert Crane had been using the tunnel the same way he had, and likely more than once. If this were the case, Thomas believed the fact had major implications on how the tunnel did and did not work. Standard thought had always suggested that one did not need to majorly interfere in the past in order to majorly upset the future. Most theories promoted the idea that even a minor action in the past could and likely would have massive implications on the future. So massive, in fact, that up to that moment, Thomas basically believed it would be impossible to exist in any form in the past without altering the future considerably. Unless, of course, that wasn't how it worked. Thomas had to accept that he was in unprecedented territory here, basing his decisions on theories set forth by those who had never traveled through time was the equivalent of basing one's understanding of the movement of the sun in the sky on the theories of the Aztecs. Bert had already traveled between the past and the future, sometimes existing within both at the same time, without causing any major issue. There was, of course, the possibility that Bert had caused major issues and Thomas just didn't remember the change, because the change only occurred to a timeline Bert, the one doing the changing, remembered. But if that was the case, everything was already ruined anyways, and no one would ever know or be able to prove it. Beyond that, if Bert had traveled through time, Thomas was almost certain others had as well. After all, as soon as time travel is a possibility, travelers could not only be coming from the future, but the past as well. The more he thought about it, the less the danger of fouling up the universal timeline beyond repair seemed legitimate. The fact that he was where he was and nothing had happened seemed to indicate it must not work that way. But how did it work then? Perhaps ironically, it was neither these justifications nor the scientific theories he was wrestling with that ultimately changed Thomas's mind about what he should or shouldn't do in the past. Thomas Redmond, the brilliant mind who had taken his father's work and realized it into the power source that made time travel possible, was ultimately done in, like so many others, by his emotions. When he saw the advertisement for his family's store, when he saw his grandfather's cheesy smile, when he checked the addresses of his other family members, his mother, her parents, the river house his father had grown up on, when he saw those things were all right there with him, when he saw they were real, more real than any theory, more real now even than the world he'd grown up in and left behind. He just wanted to experience them, needed to experience them. And so, Thomas Redmond made a number of decisions that many would later question. He decided that how long he played Bert's game was completely up to him now, that in the morning he would go with Heather to Conkle's Hollow, just to see if Bert was there. But after that, he was going to go his own way, with or without the help of either of them. And his first destination, he decided, was going to be Dublin, Ohio, to see what his family was up to. The unyielding flow of time had dictated Thomas's life long enough. He was calling the shots now.